afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Anil Prakash. I'm Director General with SIA-India, and we are doing the today webinar, India-US Export Control Dialogue, Bridging Innovation with IndUS US Tech. So this is the series, the first series, and we're going to do a couple of series with other countries, later starting with Australia, Japan, and some European countries. So we will let you know the schedule as we go along. And we called it is a PRISM Perspective Regulatory Issue in Strategic Market webinar series. And today we have a distinguished speaker with us who will touch upon both from the US side about the export control SO as well as from India. So CIA is a non-profit space sector association, and we have a membership.
Did we lose Anilji?
I would like to hand over mic to Dr. Chaitanya. He is a Space and Emerging Tech Fellow at Observe Research Foundation, and I personally know him for known for decades, and he is the one who's going to throw a light on ITAR, ER, CFIUS, and recent efforts to facilitate exports from India. Over to Dr. Chaitanya.
So, Anilji, thank you very much. I thank Nikita, I thank Kriti Upadhyay for inviting me to this very interesting webinar on the US India Export Controls Dialogue. That has been a pain point in terms of understanding, in terms of comprehending, especially for the startups and especially for the Indian private sector that is wanting to get into the space and dual use technology domains. Pain point, why did I say that? Why did I use that word? Because, export controls really, they invoke a lot of apprehension. They invoke a lot of, deterrence, a mental deterrence when it comes to approaching certain countries with certain kind of exports. And particularly exports that are dealing with military tech as well as dual use. And when it comes to the India-United States relation, I think perhaps ITAR EAR is one of the last remaining ironing points for the two countries to pursue, so that there is a seamless exchange of technology, there is a seamless exchange of talent, there is a seamless exchange of R&D output, and all of this put together is going to help both the countries in their comprehensive strategic partnership. Yet at the same time, it is also going to help India, for that matter, gain a lot from the US, that has made great strides when it comes to high technologies in the last century. So, if you look at the power structure in the world, you will definitely see India growing to the ranks of becoming the third largest economy on the planet. And that also means that we have to also ensure that this particular bilateral, the India-US bilateral, has to progress in the greater interest of the world. Yet at the same time, it will also have to go through or ride over quite a few bumpy, patches on the road. And one of the bumpy patches is the ITAR, EAR, and SCOMET on our side. So getting to know each other, getting to know the realms of regulations is very important. I'm pretty sure the learned panel that I am right now in will touch base upon SCOMET, which is the Indian export control. But let me give a brief on ITAR and EAR, because that's the brief I was given by Nikita this morning. So what is ITAR? What is EAR? So if I simply put it, ITAR is the International Traffic in Arms Regulation. It is a very military specific, military grade item specific regulation, export control regulation, which deals with not only hardware but also software, also services, as well as technical documents. And if you have a technology which is dealing with a military grade product, you have to be very careful that ITAR will come into force, especially when it comes to a product or a service or a document that has a strong US stake in it. At the same time, when you look at the EAR, the Export Administration Regulation, uh, that takes care of technologies that are dual use in nature and which are limited to commercial or even certain civilian items that have that dual use connotation to them. So ITAR is military grade, EAR is the commercial grade items. Then if you want to check if your products, if your services, if your documents belong to any of the ITAR regulated categories, you have to look at the USML list. The USML list is governed by the Arms Export Control Act uh, of the US Congress, and the act has provided a very substantial federal framework to control all these defense related items. Whereas on the other hand, you have the Commerce Control List, the CCL, which is governing the EAR, and the CCL is a very distinct list when it comes to what is present in the USML, which the ITAR looks into. But the CCL also has a few categories within it. These categories include nuclear materials, it includes certain sensitive chemicals, it includes telecom products, which are of concern to us at SIA India. And then there are products, there are equipments, there are technologies, there are documents. You have to take care of all of them. Now, when it comes to the regulatory body, the Directorate of Defense Trade and Controls is the regulatory body when it comes to the ITAR, and it requires all the manufacturers, those who are dealing again with US entities. Uh, so it could be manufacturers, it could be sellers, it could be consultants like us, it could be contractors, it could be distributors. We all have to register with the ITAR regulatory authority, which is the DDTC that I just spoke of. And the DDTC is the one that will offer you the license after vetting your case, vetting your company, vetting the technologies that you're building, so on and so forth. So that's the regulatory body for ITAR. For the EAR, the export regulations are a bit more flexible, yet at the same time they are comprehensive. You have to go through a certain license application, which is known as SNAPR, which is an online system, and it is managed by the Bureau of Industrial Security. I remember a few months ago, the US consulate in Bengaluru had organized a very nice exposition of uh, the possibilities of India-US trade within the confines of ITAR and EAR, and that was a wonderful sort of you know exposure to Indian companies, all those who attended it. But one event is not enough. A webinar like this, which would eventually go on social media channels, will play a major role to instill confidence in Indian companies who want to work with the US entities. So I gave you a brief on what ITAR and EAR is. Now coming to the reality of today. The reality of today is that India, as I said, and the US, the relation is going super fine in certain areas, but then there are certain areas which I, as a strategic affairs analyst, can definitely speak on. Is uh, I can speak on the pain points, and one of the pain points is the sanctions that have recently come on 19 entities. So these are entities that are into building aircraft components. They are into building electronic components, integrated circuits. They are into microelectronics. Uh, they are into roller bearing, machine tools, certain dual use technologies. And all of these companies, all these 19 companies, I won't name them, but they have been sanctioned for doing business with Russian counterparts. Now, India has a legacy issue. The legacy issue is that classically all our defense and space tech companies or contractors have been in touch with Russian entities. And this is one of the main concerns that when you come into the US gravitational pull. The US gravitational pull compels you to abide with certain regulations and laws, which is fair enough. It is very well justified. But then one of the Indian concerns is that how do we dissociate with the businesses that have been linked with each other for decades, especially with entities in Russia, in Eastern Europe. We've done business with in Africa. We've done business in Eastern Europe, in Southeast Asia. So one of the pain points that will continue to remain, and maybe discussions like these will address them, is how do we mend these differences? Now, India has always ensured that whatever we've exported, even to countries of concern to the US, we've we've abided by non-proliferation laws and treaties, which are the international law non-proliferation treaties. Now, when you abide by international laws, uh, that should take care of a lot of concerns that the US or maybe the US partners are having about us. Yet at the same time, you must also realize that uh, there have been cases which I have been also speaking about where US high tech businesses have also continued their dealings with Russia. Like, for instance, the titanium business with Russia went on for a very long time, even after Russian entities were being sanctioned 2016, 2017 onwards. And when Indian companies or the Indian government was being coaxed off for not to purchase the S-400 missiles, this was in 2018. We had to tell the US that, look, you also are continuing with your businesses. Boeing has a strong business going on with VSMP or Avisma, which was the titanium supplier. That relation went kaput more recently in 2022 after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the business went on for a very long time. So we have to get on the board. We have to get on the table, deal with these issues very frankly, in a candid manner. And as an Indian strategic affairs analyst, I can vouch for the fact that India has never been party to any conflict. We have never been sort of a progenitor of any conflict. But yet at the same time, we have business happening all across the planet. We may be doing businesses with countries that are of concern to you, but there are certain leeways that need to be offered, because those are the leeways that are also offered to American companies. So let's have these discussions even more in the upcoming platforms, and I'm sure that the consternations, the apprehensions will get solved over the due course of time. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Chitani. There is a constant dialogue is going on both at the government to government level, and I think this is our initiative. Do it from the private sector level. I think that will definitely push both the countries to a position where each one is comfortable. So now I like to invite Vinayak Dalmia, Head of Business Development Strategy from Third ITech. He will be sharing his success and challenges for startup stories. So, Vinayak Dalmia, floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for having me here. It's a very important topic. Look, at the outset, I have maybe 3 or 4 distinct points to make based on my own experience for the last perhaps 5-6 years. Um, Before that, I think at the outset, one thing that I'm a firm believer in, and I'm assuming most of us who are in such a webinar will also be firm believers of that, which is the following: that the next probably 2 to 3 decades, the most important geopolitical partnership is going to be between the two countries, India and US. Secondly, the most important foundation of this said geopolitical partnership is going to be based on co-creation of critical and emerging technology. We have a common challenge in the Indo-Pacific, and it's not a trivial challenge. It's not business as usual. And the only way both countries create a common deterrence and create a shared prosperity is by coming together on all sorts of critical emerging technology. With that as a background, my experience, for the past 5-6 years is the following. One, I think sometimes young companies, because they get overwhelmed with export approval processes, start, before they even begin the journey, they start getting so overwhelmed that they just, almost put their hands up saying, okay, ITAR, EAR, TA can't be done, it's too difficult, and either give up or complain or try and instinctively find a workaround. And none of those three things work. At the end of the day, every government, including our own, have processes and have regulations. Of course, often those are cumbersome and could improve. But till such time that those processes are improving, we have to live with them and we have to respect the process. What that means is actually in our experience as a company and as a group, if you just acknowledge that a process has to be adhered to for export approvals, EAR, IR, or others, and actually you just go and do the hard work, eventually you get success. Eventually, actually, sometimes fast, sooner than you realize, you get export approvals. So that's point number one, that it's a process and it's not designed to trick you. It's there for a certain reason, and if we adhere to it, and if it's there for, and if our case is valid for more often than not, you will see success. That's point number one. Point number two, I think when industry, and this is particularly for Indian industry, when we have the opportunity to present our case to governments, both on the Indian side and on the US side, my strong recommendation, again, this is based on my limited experience, so you must take that with a pinch of salt because this is one person's experience or one company's experience. But our limited experience is that when we are presenting our case to governments on either side, it is far more productive a conversation when, even if we want them to improve certain processes or think about certain policy reforms, if we approach the conversation constructively and come up with a better alternative or a better suggestion, as opposed to entering the room with the mindset of complaining. Third, I think, is especially for young businesses, when we are looking at trying to create collaborations under, let's say, a dialogue like I said, I think the main thing to think about, and this is hard, this is not easy, the last point, but the main thing to think about is go back to the drawing board saying, okay, what do I as a company bring to the table? And how can pairing somebody, if they pair with me, what value creation happens? Because all of us, and this is very human, as individuals and as organizations, both large and small, our base instinct to enter a conversation is saying, what's in it for me? How do I extract whatever I wish to extract? The harder thing to do is to go back and do a little bit of soul searching and go back to the drawing board saying, how do I genuinely offer, what do I bring to the table, what value do I create? And if entity X or entity Y or individual X or individual Y does actually end up collaborating with me, this is the way it creates a win-win collaboration. If, and I'm not saying it's simple or it's trivial, this last point, so please don't get me wrong, it takes a lot of hard work to understand what our sweet spot offering might be, especially as a young business. But if you're able to identify that, that's your highest probability of success, and it's your highest probability of actually genuine co-development or cooperation with counterparts in other countries. So I think that's sort of, you know, the long and short of it. I'm not here to say that the export approval processes in either country, by the way, are simple. I'm not here to say that they don't need to be reformed. They do. And this is both countries have export approval processes which can be improved. And let's assume, you know, eventually at some point in a relative timeline, it does get improved. But till such time, we have to honor the process, work within it, and you'll be surprised how often you will see success. Second, if we meet government counterparts with positive, constructive suggestions, more often than not, they try their best to onboard those and try and work in creating reforms. And then three, especially for younger businesses, to think really about value creation and what they bring to the table. And that's when you will create the win-win partnerships with counterparts in forums such as I said. Whatever you may have seen, you know, again, this is one company, so it's one case study, but whatever we have seen as success becomes public today, or some of it has gotten public of late. But it's important to understand that none of this is overnight. It's important to understand that we have been, you know, plugging away at most of what you may have heard in the public forum for the last 5-6 years. Consistently, with persistence and diligently, right? Even predating ISET. We began working 6 years ago in export approval with US, working on collaboration with US counterparts, both large and small companies, with the US government directly for almost 6 years. This predates the pandemic, it predates ISET, and it's that consistent cumulative effort that eventually leads to extremely meaningful outcomes. But it's not overnight. It may look overnight, but it's definitely not overnight. So I think that's sort of my experience, my perspective. And if there are any questions, I think I'm open to. I know this is meant to be more an address, but to be honest, this is sort of more my experiences. And if there are any specific questions, I'm happy to answer. But I hope what I'm trying to say, especially our Indian counterparts, understand that if we, again, you know, I don't want to repeat myself, but I hope we understand the three essential pillars. If you want to work with counterparts in foreign countries, particularly in the US, if you want to be successful with export approval, you have to analyze these three things that I've just said, and you have to be consistent. It's not going to happen overnight. Is when you will start seeing actually results. And the reason I'm saying that is because if you go back to what I originally said and how I started this conversation, that I do believe the next 2-3 decades belong to, from a geopolitical perspective, belong to this India-US collaboration, and it will transcend election results. It will transcend local politics. Second, I truly believe the foundation of this said geopolitical relationship is going to be on jointly creating value in critical and emerging technology.
Thank you. Thank you, Vinayak, for your sharing your views. Now I'd like to invite Keur Gandhi, Director Space Regulatory from Dhruva Space. He will continue his journey of the space successes, challenges for space startups. Over to Keur Gandhi.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you for inviting me to share the experience here. I think at the risk of repetition, I would like to begin by saying, yes, India and US is going to be one of the most significant relationships that will be there in the coming decade. And especially, I would like to start by shedding some light on the space sector and its developments that have been there in the past 3 years, 3 short years. It's been about 3 years now that India declared that private space entities would be allowed to build and launch their own missions. And since then, we have seen a rapid emergence of private space tech enterprises in India. That is continuing the legacy of existing vendors and enterprises which were there catering to the demand from ISRO and also certain SATCOM operators who were providing services in the country. This new era of emerging space tech enterprises, or new space as we call them, is something that is global in nature. And naturally, the conversation around US and Indian enterprises collaborating each other did emerge at the outset. So I would like to begin by sharing my experience a little bit on how did we really navigate and how did we reach the juncture where we were able to successfully collaborate with US enterprises, and how we found our way in navigating through the regulatory framework on both sides for export control. Something that would be useful for a lot of the new enterprises, so to say. I think one common factor that helped us is the outreach programs that were conducted. I know I cannot pronounce the importance of these programs more than what I'm trying to say. When we look at the export regulatory framework on both sides, it is inherently challenging. It is difficult to navigate through the various codes and the various sections in which the controls are divided. But the first step would be to understand how these controls work, and attending one of these outreach sessions can incredibly simplify one's understanding. Why I'm sharing this, I would like to begin by pointing out that yes, like all other enterprises, even we started out with a bunch of questions on what is and is not possible. We really wanted to break down the mindset or the presumption barrier on what is and is not possible. To give some useful points today, I think India's status as STA1 in the US framework of export regulation is really helpful when we are looking at components for spacecraft or allied items. Most of these components fall within the commerce control list. I think this should get simplified even further with the amendments that are ongoing. It is, to my best knowledge, it is in the final rulemaking stage, and we should expect positive outcomes. Coming to the next part on how do we navigate the framework on both sides and what have been the most useful approaches. I think one is understanding why export controls exist. Broadly categorizing it in two parts. One, there are international agreements and conventions that require each country to observe certain obligations on disarmament and controlling technologies that can be used in weapons of mass destruction, can be used in missile technology, can be used in biochemical warfare, nuclear energy, and things as such. Spacecrafts and satellites and allied technologies do fall within the same category. So naturally, the curiosity comes out in the nature of end use, which is there for the given items, in the nature of end user that is there for the said item. In doing this, one of the key things has been implementing effective programs internally and building confidence on both sides with respect to an organization's ability to ensure that there will be no divergence of technology into other users, and these technologies can be effectively safeguarded. With this as a focus point, one of the resounding recommendations, I think, from both the US government and the Indian government has been towards building effective internal compliance programs, because after navigating the framework and actually approaching respective governments, this internal compliance program will stand as a testimonial to how reliable our is one company in terms of being able to deal with dual use technologies. The third thing, which I think has not been highlighted enough in the conversation so far, is there is a positive attitude from both sides to ease controls on certain space technology items, and we are seeing the first step today. There have been launches from Indian territory on US and vice versa. There are companies which are collaborating closely on space technology projects as well. So we are seeing success cases emerge. But what lies in the next step, which needs to be highlighted, is the space programs started out in the Cold War era. That means there was a lot of reliance of military use in that period. Today, we are talking about commercial space enterprises where the end use necessarily is not defense or strategic initiative related either. So the shift of looking at growing commercial space as opposed to looking strictly at space programs is something that should be highlighted more and more. And we are seeing a change in attitude from both sides in the government, where regulators are slowly becoming enablers. From our personal experience, I think I can at least share in the public forum that we have had uh, really good experience on both sides when you try to approach as an emerging enterprise, willing to do business on either sides of the conversation. And going forward, we hope that will only increase, and space being a topic of discussion in ISET as well. And with Artemis Accords also having been signed between the countries, I think confidence building and trust building between the two countries will come at an imperative point soon, where we can progress further. And last but not the least, I would like to share a very small experience of what we learned in our journey while trying to get our first license through. I know it's an incredibly difficult framework to navigate, but I think on India side, looking at the SCOMET list is relatively easier on the DGFT website, where you get primary training programs and you also see primary webinars on how to navigate the list. And it is similar when we went to the BIS website. A lot of our questions ended up getting answered in terms of how to identify commodities using ECC, and how to identify controls, and how to identify which list do we fall in with respect to the country we are in, and these basic things as such. So to summarize, yes, it's been a positive experience, and what we look forward to is something, uh, uh, some measures probably on easing navigating the regulation, so to say, because we understand that it might take time for the regulations to change, but the space industry is changing now. People are looking at launching missions in less than 1 year, from ideation to actually launching. But that in summary should help anyone who is looking to uh, work between India and US in the future. I think those are my remarks, open to any questions.
Thank you, Akur, for sharing your experience and thought. So we'll come back to the question from the audience in the question hour. Now I'd like to invite Ashish Chandra, partner DSK Legal. Uh, he will touch upon the best practice for industry leaders in building an export control compliance program. So over to Mr. Ashish Chandra.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Arya. Good evening to all my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be invited here, and thank you for this opportunity. So, my previous speakers have already touched upon a lot of important aspects. I will not be going too detail into that, given the limited time we all have. And I think just to give you a brief intro, we normally advise companies on complying with these export regulations, especially from an Indian law perspective. So just we'll be sharing some insights, how we can go about, complying with these regulations and these international regimes to which India is also a party. So just to give you a brief overview, starting, under the Indian foreign trade policy, there is a provision for regulating or prohibited trade in items which are sensitive or have dual uses application in civilian and military applications, and they have to be either, traded subject to the approval of the concerned government authorities, or they are absolutely not allowed to be traded. And these regulations are updated from in a very timely manner, and they're also in compliance with a lot of India's international obligations and international conventions, which are to be followed even as per the Indian laws. So these standards which are there in India, they're in compliance with the international agreements, and therefore compliance more or less can be keeping in view those obligations. Now, for a company, in terms of, especially for Indian companies who are looking to comply with these kind of regulations, it's very important to have a very robust internal compliance program, or typically ICP as we call it. Now, ICPs, to be honest, cannot be very uniform. They will vary depending upon the company's nature of business, especially trading in business in particular items. If requirements for trading in say space equipments could be different from say requirement in say in some kind of sensitive services which are to be traded, or those kind of items. So depending upon the nature of the business of the company, the size of the business, the vertical of the company which would be exposed to these kind of import or export, that needs to be taken into consideration, and a full risk assessment has to be done by a particular company while devising that their internal risk assessment. So that is very, very important from a company to lay down an internal robust policy wherein responsibilities and accountability is also, and roles of individuals are laid down as to which individual and which committees, internal committees, would look after which aspects. So from a company aspect, it is very, very important that these internal frameworks are very very robust. They are updated. There is proper record keeping of these transactions in a very timely manner, because a lot of approvals, especially from the US law perspective and even from some of the Indian law perspective, will depend upon how robust your record keeping is. Then in terms of identifying and training the personnel internally, that is also a very, very key challenge for these companies, because as I said, these regulations can evolve over a period of time. These can be very complex in nature, and some of the personnel may not be really be trained enough or expert enough to understand some of these regulations. So it's very important from a company's point of view to regularly train their internal resources who are handling these kind of activities. Apart from that, it's also very important to have a proper screening procedure wherein you would be able to identify any red flags while dealing with any kind of transactions. These red flags could be on account of your say vendors who you could be onboarding. These red flags could be on account of your vendor end user certifications which may not be forthcoming, or end use applications which may not be really be disclosed to your companies. So there can be various kind of red flags which needs to be looked into while dealing with various kind of vendors and third parties, and therefore there has to be a proper screening procedure internally as part of your ICP to identify and red flag some transactions which needs to be further scrutinized in detail. Now, within the entire ICP, I think one of the role of the top management becomes very important. It is without any gainsaying that the if the incentive and the push comes from the top management, the entire compliance within the company will be more robust, and therefore I think within the ICP the top management will play a very important role in terms of the commitment of the company to comply with those such kind of regulations, and therefore the involvement of the top management becomes very, very important. Now, what happens in terms of say technologies, I think one of the recent things that is evolving right now is that there are a lot of technologies which could be useful in complying with these regulations. For example, you can internally build up various softwares which could be which could contain a list of all the entities which are already on the prohibited list under various regimes. For example, if the US has prohibited certain entities as part of their export control regimes, and if you are maintaining those kind of internal lists, and people internally who are dealing with this kind of technologies can readily access those kind of lists. So that is very, very becomes very important for people internally to refer to these kind of materials as readily available, and comply with these kind of regulations. Another problem which often comes is in terms of violations. So whenever a violation occurs or there's a likely violation, companies do not really understand or do not really know how to approach these violations. Sometimes the companies try may also think about not revealing these kind of violations. But in my understanding and my experience, the best practice is honesty and transparency, given the nature of the potential violation and the ramifications it may cause in terms of technologies and sensitivity therein. It's very important to keep the regulator informed about any potential violations or the violation if it has already occurred. It's also very important to do a very internal risk assessment or a kind of inquiry as to why such a violation occurred, not only to identify the present issue, but also from a future ongoing perspective to identify any loopholes in your internal compliance program, and that needs to be plugged in going forward, so that such violations may not occur going forward. So it's very, very important that whenever such violations occur, complying and notifying the regulatory authorities is very, very important. Also, becomes very important to consult a good legal counsel, so that your internal policies and how to navigate some of these complex regulations and export compliances requirements, they such compliances can be in accordance with these laid down procedures, especially in terms of documentations, because often companies are not really aware of what kind of documentations are required to be fulfilled while importing or exporting these kind of technologies or products. So therefore it becomes very, very important for companies to also work with either their internal legal teams or external counsels if required, to complying with the documentation requirement as well. Otherwise, a failure therein also would require huge kind of penalties or any kind of other actions as laid down under the law. So these are some of the few important issues coming from the compliance requirements. Now, in terms of legal support, I think typically what we always do with our clients, we there are various clients where we annually or maybe after 6 to 8 months we update various compliance chapters, which would be a ready reckoner for internal teams to comply. We assist them in training of their internal staff, how to go about these compliance requirements. We also help them in guiding in proper product classification, because tariff classification sometimes can be very, very complex issue given the legal complexities and legal precedents and decisions and so on. And some of these technologies can follow the different kind of tariff classification. So it's very, very important to ensure that your tariff classification is spot on, and that will also determine your liabilities and compliance requirements. So from that perspective also, it becomes very important to engage with either internal legal counsel or an external legal counsel in correctly identifying some of these product classifications. So these are some of the key issues in terms of complying with the Indian law, especially the SCOMET and other requirements. BIS still is an emerging area of law that is more, I think, from a standards perspective, and it still does not, I think, go into the realm of a kind of a trade barrier from export control. But yes, compliance with BIS also becomes very, very important, especially if you want to import or export those products into India. But typically, SCOMET will always be very, very important and will be important, more complex to comply with. These are some of the preliminary observations I have with respect to some of the legal or best practices with respect to export control. Happy to answer any questions anyone has, and look forward to further discussion on this.
Well, thank you, Ashish Chandraji, for your comments and advice on the compliance issue. Thank you very much. The people will get benefit of your programs. Thank you very much. Now we are moving to the second phase of our dialogue. We will have two experts with us. They're going to talk about pathway forward. And we start with Konark Bhandari, fellow Kargi, India, and followed by David Logsdon, Senior Director, Space Enterprise Council, ITI, Washington, D.C. So I will hand over floor to Konark Bhandari, please.
Thank you, Mr. Prakash, and thank you for the invitation. And also, it's a pleasure to be with all the panelists on this much-needed discussion on export controls. Now, if it's possible, I would like to give a very brief 3 to 4 slideshow and present it. So just give me a few seconds. I'll just share the screen. Share. Yeah. Can everybody see this? Okay. So I think I'll begin with the issue of why export controls. I think it's important to sort of give our audience members who may be joining in this online webinar and just trying to understand what is the reason why the US has sort of put together such a complicated export control regime. So essentially, this slide talks about how the modern export control regime emerged post World War II, when U.S. was the leading supplier of many tech goods. So export controls basically are tools to safeguard technology from falling into the wrong hands. So there is definitely a national security element over there, right? As we will see in the following slides, there's also a tension when it comes to sort of balancing national security imperatives, but also at the same time trying to ensure that the commercial enterprises are able to export the tech which they create into overseas markets. So I think this has already been covered by Dr. Giri as to what the ITAR is, what the EAR is, what the USML and CCL entails. So I'll skip this last bullet point. So these are just a few recent developments which have happened when it comes to U.S. and India export control bilateral issues. As Dr. Giri mentioned, that there was indeed a workshop organized in Bangalore, and then even Carnegie India also last year organized a workshop on U.S. export controls. The idea was to really familiarize Indian stakeholders with the procedural framework when it comes to U.S. export controls, which is rather convoluted. So it was as a part of these workshop that Assistant Secretary Thea Kendler in the Department of Commerce in U.S. came down and basically talked about how, when you look at this longer time frame from the late 90s onwards, the overall trend has been that the U.S. has been increasingly liberalizing bilateral tech commerce with India, and the trend is in a very positive direction. So as Keyur mentioned as well, we have an STA-1 exemption issued by the U.S. Department of Commerce. This was a recent thing which came out 6 years ago. Now, something I will, however, bring up is that the amount of trade which is done pursuant to this particular trade authorization is rather limited. So I think, if I understand correctly, the most recent figures for 2023 are $9.2 million. So it's not very clear as to why is the amount of commerce which has been transacted under the STA exemption so limited. Number three is the MTCR reform, which was essentially for all the countries which are a part of the MTCR, including India. This was essentially talking about how if you are going to be exporting any kind of satellites or satellite components to fellow MTCR members, they'll be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. Now, this may not seem like a very big change, but the reality is that this was actually a pretty big shift from where things were earlier, which is that there was always a presumption of denial earlier whenever such applications were made. So this was a very welcome, welcome development for Indian enterprises, which may have been looking to source satellite components from the US. So what are the possible ways? What are the possible pathways ahead? So as I mentioned, STA exception remains severely underutilized, right? So what could be the reason for this? I think it would be very beneficial for the export control bureaucracies in both the countries to actually undertake a scoping exercise, where they can actually do a kind of a stakeholder feedback, look at the data on the ground, that why is the STA not being used much to begin with? Because my take on the issue is that if you are going to go to the US and if you are going to make the case under this strategic trade dialogue, which was initiated earlier last year in May, if you're going to be making an ask for liberalization of further export control measures, then I think the question which will come from the US side is, that's all fine, but why haven't you used the current exception of the STA-1, which is already on the books? So I think this is important in terms of, knowing where we stand right now on the STA-1 before any further asks are made as a part of the, this commerce control list. Number two, indeed, there were some changes, suggested last year in December 2023. It was a draft rule, and I think, as Keyur said correctly, it is in the final rulemaking stage. But there are certain things which was in that draft rule which are quite worrisome. So, for example, India is actually an A5 country, but the draft rules actually constrict and tighten and further restrict the transfer of tech and the spacecraft components to certain A6 countries, right? But now the new rules actually club the A5 and A6 countries all together in the same category. So this is a worrisome development, because earlier this was not the case, that India was, a part of a group which was facing any restrictions when it came to when it came to tech transfer as a part of the STA-1. But now with the new proposed rules, and again we'll see what the final rule actually looks like. Certain things, for example, in this slide I mentioned how flight control systems. These essentially are not going to find it harder to be transferred to countries, including A5 countries in India, if the final rule retains this proposed rule. So this is, I think, even of concern to Indian civil aviation authorities as well, because even the DGCA in India insists on all flights, on sort of all, aircrafts having some kind of a flight control system. And I think this is not uh, going to be sort of seen by the regulators in India as a positive development. This is the more recent development. Open source software, which is essentially something which allows a developer to release the source code of the product and allow anyone to reuse it or modify it as per their liking. So in May 2024 of this year, a bipartisan group of lawmakers in the U.S. House introduced something called the Enforce Act. Right now, this is not a law as of now. This is indeed a bill as of now, which has been passed by the House Foreign Affairs Committee. But the thing is, we don't know how the Trump administration will actually view this particular law. But there is increasingly a momentum in the US House to essentially consider having regulation of exporting of open source AI models. There have even been reports in the last 1 month by Reuters how Chinese enterprises have actually been able to use this open source software, open source AI models, and tweak it and come up with military applications as well. So this is certainly a worrisome development, and I think the BIS in US is indeed tracking this. But for Indian companies, it's a cause of concern because Indian firms largely rely on open source AI models. Indian AI firms rely heavily on these models. So if there's going to be any constriction of the flow of AI models or open AI source models or the use by Indian enterprises, it is possible that India might just sort of look for a different mode to access it. Now, would this mean more sovereign AI? Would this mean making your own sort of focus on homegrown AI models? We don't know, but I think this law, if this bill, if it indeed becomes a law, might have an impact on the Indian AI ecosystem as well. Now, last is the recent export control changes, which have come out in the form of a final rule just a few weeks back. This is just a recommendation which I make on this slide, but essentially it talks about how the ITAR proposed rule, one of the many rules which has been introduced in the space export control changes in the last few weeks, is how there's something called excluded NASA spacecraft, right? Essentially, it says that anything which falls within the purview of the definition of an excluded NASA spacecraft would not be included as part of the ITAR controls. And they have in this defined that to mean the International Space Station and the James Webb Space Telescope as well. So the argument which I want to make here is that is it possible for India and the US to identify certain joint projects like the NISAR? India has spoken openly about possibly exploring participation in the Gateway program. India has also announced a month or two ago its own Bharatiya Antariksh station as well. But the issue is, could India use, or could the US and India identify certain projects which could be worked on together and then subsequently exclude them from the purview of applicability of the ITAR controls? Again, we don't know, but this is just a humble recommendation which I make in the course of this presentation. So that is my introductory remarks, and happy to take questions in the Q&A round.
Thanks, Konark, for your really very good path forward with the discussion going on both ITAR and EAR. So now the second leg, I will request David Longthorn to please present your thought on way forward.
Thank you, Anil. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I think I've covered everybody. As I bring up my slide deck, let me let's see. Bear with me for a second. All right. Having trouble finding my slide deck, so I do have my slides. Oh, here we go. Perfect. So before I jump into my slides, let me very quickly talk about what I think is a poster child for a foreign company that wants to break into the U.S. market. And so the company is Satellogic. They're a satellite imagery company headquartered in Uruguay. About 5 years ago, they looked at how to enter the U.S. market. They had a large Chinese investor. They quickly realized that they had to divest any connection to that Chinese investor if they wanted to break into the U.S. market. They did, quickly complied with all the rules and regulations that they needed to in order to break into the U.S. market, set up a very small U.S. office, and within a matter of years, they were able to go after U.S. contracts and are now traded on the NASDAQ index on the U.S. stock market. So I will quickly put into the comments the name of the company, and then I will get into my presentation. There they are. Okay. So next slide, please. So very quickly, who I am and who I represent. So the Information Technology Industry Council is the largest technology trade association in the United States. We have 80 member companies, everybody from Microsoft to Amazon and everybody in between. And we are known as having the policy experts in every single technology issue you could think of, whether it's cyber, 5G, AI, cloud, what have you. The Space Enterprise Council was brought over to ITI a year and a half ago. The Space Enterprise Council, which I run, was created in 2000 on the behest of NASA and Department of Commerce. They wanted a commercial voice for space. In Washington, D.C., of course, it wasn't much of an industry then, but the Space Enterprise Council was stood up. I came over from the Aerospace Industries Association in 2003 to run it, and have been running it ever since. And we have three primary focuses: international collaboration. In spring of this year, we were honored to sign an MOU with the leading space trade association in India, SIA-India. We also have a strong focus on space and cybersecurity. I will get into the IEEE Space and Cybersecurity Standard Group in a moment. And then the integration of emerging technology into space missions. Next slide, please. So indeed, we are the two largest democracies in the world, continent-sized countries, enormous land and maritime borders. We have a heritage of working together dating back to 1963. And over the past few years, the engagement has picked up significantly. Host and landmark agreements, including, and I would recommend our friends from Carnegie India put a fantastic presentation together on ISET. And it's interesting that the Indians look at space under the critical and emerging technologies perspective. And indeed, and this is something that the United States needs to realize, which it doesn't, India is a key voice working with the global South. The United States has a North Star perspective, but of course, the North Star in the Southern Hemisphere is not called the North Star, it's called Sigma Octantis. The United States has to have a much better approach working with the global South. I think India is key. Next slide, please. So I had a pretty pedestrian slide deck, but our moderator had sent over a number of questions, which I liked a lot better than what I had put together. So we're going to go over those questions really quick. As we look to the future of space exploration between the United States and India, what do you see as the most promising trends that will drive this partnership forward? And it is not technology, it's not exploration. Indeed, in my mind, it is framing the discussions regarding standards and interoperability. Whatever the United States and India wants to do together in terms of space on a global stage, you need those fundamental building blocks of standards and interoperability in place. And India has that reach, as I mentioned, into the global South. Are there any specific areas such as satellite technology or space exploration where you see the most potential for joint initiatives? Space exploration, of course, as I see it, is the low-hanging fruit. But building a joint ecosystem that focuses on downstream capabilities is where you'll get the most innovation and where you'll see the most economic and societal benefits. Next slide. With advancements in AI, quantum, next-gen satellite capabilities, edge computing, so on and so forth. How can we better leverage these technologies to strengthen their space collaboration? I don't think we have a clear demand signal on either side yet on how to integrate emerging technologies into programs. I think that needs to be clarified. And you do need that fundamental building block of standardization and interoperability in place in order to do anything. We've spoke at length on export policy, and we'll jump into that. But we need to figure out what the two governments are actually trying to solve. That's the demand signal. And also, I don't know if this could be the case or not, but there's been a track 1.5 on space. But I think where we would see the real value is if you take the space industry in the private sector, the technology industry in the private sector, get them together in a track 1.5 that includes both sectors. I think that would be very interesting. I think that would drive innovation. Next slide, please. So the private sector has played an increasingly important role in space exploration, where the key opportunities to collaborate in space innovation, how can government policies help facilitate these partnerships? So I don't think there are enough matchmaking opportunities that take place. This one can help facilitate that. I mentioned that Space Enterprise Council has an MOU with SIA-India. Each side doesn't know what they don't know, the private sectors. I guarantee you that 90% of the U.S. private sector companies have no idea the emerging capabilities of the Indian commercial sector. So many more of these matchmaking opportunities need to take place. And on the government side, progress on export policy, and I would point to looking at what has just happened in terms of the United States and Australia and the UK, and look at lessons learned from the loosening of export controls between the United States and those two countries, and see if there are lessons learned that could be baked into U.S. India export policy reform. And then finally, I think there is a golden opportunity for the two countries to drive a lunar system, surface system risk assessment study. India has reached into the global south. And many of those countries are now members of the Artemis Accord, so is India. I think there's a golden opportunity to have the two countries drive this risk assessment study. And then there is a pivotal role for the private sectors on both sides. Next slide. Space infrastructure, satellite constellations, communicate, critical for both countries. How do you ensure that there are more resilient space systems? So IEEE is in the process of creating a global space and cybersecurity standard based on secure by design, looking at the various segments that compose the space ecosystem, launch, ground, links, so on and so forth. SIA-India is now the vice chair of the International Government Subcommittee. I am the chair. It is a way for our two countries to drive this global standard, which is absolutely essential to ensure resilient space systems. Next slide. In what ways can both the governments and private sectors expand the scope of space collaboration? As I mentioned, lunar system, the surface risk assessment study, and the track 1.5 that includes both the space and technology sectors. Next slide, please. And finally, a slide on a question on workforce and talent development. Each country does have highly skilled, highly trained workforce, but are they being trained for the right requirements? The right requirements need to come from the respective governments. I don't know if we're there in terms of understanding the future right requirements. What are we trying to address? What are we trying to solve? I don't think we understand the demand signal in terms of the requirements that need to be baked into the future workforce. And again, there needs to be integration between the technology industry and space industry. Technology industry, I would argue, is steps ahead of the space industry in terms of defining those requirements. What can we learn from the technology industries from both countries and have that integrated into the space industry? Final slide. And thank you. Indeed, thank you for the privilege of your time, and feel free to reach out to me at any time.
Thank you, David, for giving your thought and also putting in perspective on such of the challenges which India and US are facing, and you have put very point by point. Thank you very much for your observation, comments, and suggestion way forward. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite Colonel Arya, Chalendra Arya. He's advisor to the Ministry of Defense. Sorry for inconvenience, Colonel Arya, because you have to step out from your office because you're not able to connect because of some restriction, and he has joined back. So over to Colonel Arya. He will be touched upon on SCOMET list and recent update. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Anil. I hope I'm audible. Thank you. Thank you so much. In the South Block, we have WebEx and Bharat VC. So I did log in, but then it didn't work. So I had to quickly step out and reach home and log in from here. I work as an advisor. I'm a retired military officer. I work as an advisor in Ministry of Defense, handling our external engagements. And apart from other issues, as a policy, as a geography, I cover United States. So quickly, I'll dive into the questions which you have given to me and take them one by one. Firstly, a little bit of a larger picture. It's a very, very important topic, export controls, regulatory issues, which you have picked up. It's becoming increasingly important because the Ministry of Defense, we seek to increase our defense export to, say, 50,000 CR by 2029. Our exports are increasing. Last year, we had a 32% jump. And both the range of exported products is increasing, and we are having increased collaboration with the international partner. Now, before before I move on ahead, I just want to give everybody a perspective of how our export controls in India, in particular, are designed from an international perspective. So they are basically designed to be in compliance to honor the international treaties, obligations, bilateral, multilateral arrangements we are part of. In terms of exports, we are a signatory, and incidentally, United States is also in all three of Wassenaar. Wassenaar arrangement, as you all know, controls the exports of sensitive conventional weapon and dual-use technologies. 42 countries are there. India is there, US is there. It has two control lists, munitions and dual use. Munitions little small, dual use is over 1,000 tiers. So we have to align our SCOMET list according to this. The second one is MTCR. It has been discussed here before. Again, it's got, major arm producing countries are members, including United States. It's more focused on rockets, ballistic missiles, space, cruise missiles, and some portions of the UAV. That portion is little gray on the UAV part of it, etc. But UAVs, which are loitering munitions, would possibly be in this. We are in it since 2016. It is non-treaty, but it is voluntary. But we honor that. And third is, of course, the Australia group. Again, 42 countries, including United States. It's informal. This one focuses on, chemical, biological weapons, etc. So our obligation in these three international multilateral constructs of treaties has to get reflected in the SCOMET list. Secondly, the SCOMET list is basically not done in MOD. It is more of a DGFT, the foreign trade policies administered by DGFT. We only look at one particular vertical of it, that is the list 6, which is there. The list is a live document, as you are aware. It's available on the website. It's a live document. New items keep coming up and keep getting added. There are conversations on it. There are certain parts of it which we handle. You are all aware the MOD handles sixth the sixth part of it. Apart from DGFT, which handles bulk, MOD, which handles a certain part of it, little bit is handled by the Department of Atomic Energy. So that's how it is structured. Uh, um, uh, so we do try to have some conversations with the industry on the export controls. The conversations are mainly regarding guiding them and to help wherever there are roadblocks. For example, there are sometimes roadblocks or slow down, they don't get visibility. Industries bodies such as SIDM, they approach us, we write to the MEA or wherever there's a query raised and they're not getting that complete picture of that. Whatever is, because we totally understand that clearing the export controls is and improving the ease of doing business is equally important from the perspective of it has to go hand in hand with our export targets. Export targets cannot be met, cannot be achieved without export controls being fairly stable, mm, predictable, and uh, you know. I would say futuristic looking, because new items, especially in certain sectors, keep getting added all the time. Now, I would like to briefly cover here about the United States part of it, which is part of my question. Um, US, and it's a very apt topic, and some of it has been covered by our colleague from Carnegie, Mr. Kunal. I'll just add on to that. So, as we are a major defense partner. We have Strategic Trade Authorization 1, which is more to do with Department of Commerce. There are convergences in political, strategic, trade, etc., etc. US has a complex mechanism that you are all aware, but it's not really prevented us from doing trade whenever it is required, and both kind of trade. Like there is a defense trade, which is in terms of purchase of items from United States, fairly high-tech transport aircrafts, C-130, C-17, helicopters, MH-60 Romeo, um, artillery guns, M777, a lot of subcomponents here and there, and of late MQ-9, which is again an advanced piece of technology. So those have come through, as well as the new things where we are seeking production in India. We are seeking localization, that is the G414. It has crossed all hurdles last year, both from the Department of Defense, the Paul Mill Bureau in the State Department, the White House, and the congressional notification. And the issues which are there are being ironed out in the strategic trade dialogue, which is basically led by the Foreign Secretary with the Department of Commerce. But as I look ahead, we have to align this to future models of co-production, co-development, how this will play out. These were fairly straightforward. Many of them were purchases, and G is a new development. So how it will play out when more and more of co-production or co-development in India takes off is something which we are working on and quite say positive about it. There are positive signs. There are always ways to work around it, because there have been exemptions given to the Pillar 2 of AUKUS. So with our MDP, with our STA Status 1, with our foundational agreements in defense such as LIMOA, COMCASA, BECA, and even the GSO MIA, which prevents, which helps in information security in place. We are hoping for a better regime for India, such as exemptions under Pillar 2 of AUKUS. We understand the concerns of United States, but have been telling them in all conversations that we have excellent laws. There is IP protection. This is not China where reverse engineering and all that takes place here. So that way, there has not been any, say, loss of IP per se from India, at least in defense. As regards the second last point of mine, startups. Startups, yes, their main challenge is in the capacity because they have a small team. The same set of people are doing all this. The regulations, the export control regulations are difficult. It's not easy for everybody to understand, follow up, apply in a particular format. We do some handholding. Our IDEX Innovations for Defense Excellence does some handholding. Um, we do more of handholding in terms of giving them visibility, getting them together in the United States and some of the countries, and of course funding. And but yes, it's a takeaway that we could do some handholding to get them over the export controls regulations as well. Um, this is our thought that on the regulatory issues, it's a 360-degree picture. It cannot be compartmentalized. As we go closer to the US, they are already we have we have a booming trade with them, a largest trade partner. More and more trade, more and more defense trade takes place. More and more R&D takes place. Initiatives such as ISET, more co-production takes place. There are more political, strategic, intelligence, co-production, co-development opportunities. It will become easier. As such, the rejection rate for Indians is under the US ITAR is much lower than the global average. So I mean, we are quite positive about it, that moving in the right direction, and it's a 360-degree picture. It can't be isolated and talked in one particular, only export controls. Yeah, it's more about confidence in each other's practices, IP laws, arbitration, understanding each other's systems. And I think the important part or the litmus test would be when we go ahead and do some co-production, how we treat the IP, how these um, uh, IP in India on co-produced products is handled in terms of ITAR. And we recently done some, the Ministry of Finance has done some changes in terms of GST exemptions in MRO. So that is likely to get some MROs companies to invest in India. Many of the OEMs of aircrafts, that is Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and of engines, GE, Pratt and Whitney, and of components, say Collins, Honeywell, etc. They're all from US, so they are encouraged to set up MROs in India. That will also require ITAR exemptions and ITAR clearances, and some of it is MROs are often dual use, so it will also cover ER, that is from the commerce side. So again, it will be interesting to see how these clearances come up. So these are my
Thank you,
thoughts,
sir.
and thank you very much for
Thank, thank
inviting
you.
me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for giving a perspective from the government and what are the SCOMET is. And the dialogue is on. I think we are working together with the US government to simplify further. Now we are moving into third phase of this dialogue. Now I invite my colleague Nikita Swami Vardapati, is the Vice President of IndUS, to get into the question answer and some briefing from her. So over to Nikita.
Thank you, Mr. Anil Prakash, and thank you so much to all of our speakers for sharing the deep insights on navigating export control between US and India. Now we will open the floor for questions for the audience. I see that there are charts coming in. In the meanwhile, I'd like to start posing a couple of questions from my end, and I'll start taking questions from the chart. My first question is to Mr. Dalmia. Vinayak, you mentioned, you emphasized on the importance of the US India partnership. And you made a very brilliant point about how we shouldn't be fearing away from the export controls. Instead, we should embrace them and learn from these workshops, attend maximum possible programs that are happening, and then turn the challenges into opportunities. My question in terms of US India partnership is, how do you see Indian startups' role globally, especially in India, when you visit abroad? And
So, I mean, yeah.
sorry, if you could hold on to that, I'll send another question to another panelist, and then I'll rest from my end and take the charts questions from the chart. The other question I have is to Keyur. Keyur, if you could share, you mentioned how your experience has been working with both Indian government as well as US government. How has this collaboration influenced your business operations and compliance strategies in particular? If you could share some experience about that, it would be great. And then I'll rest from my end and take the questions from the chat. Thank you.
So I think your question was the role of Indian startups in both India and the India-US relationship or globally, right? So, like I said, it boils down to be very blunt. It boils down to Indian startups, both whether in hardware or in software, thinking about what value creation they are bringing or they can bring, right? In a paradigm where co-development or co-design is what the mandate or the requirement is, right? Whether it's the charter of the ISEC, whether it is the our own government MOD's ambition and requirement that India needs to create local companies that can move up the value chain and create more high technology, high IT businesses. So the role of Indian companies writ large is to think about what value creation they can bring to the table in these global cooperations. I think the one advantage perhaps a startup has over incumbent, maybe larger companies, is that they usually have a disruptive mindset in a positive way. What that means is they're able to, founders at least, are able to ask themselves two fundamental questions when faced with something that's never been done before. That is, so what and why not? And when I say something that's never been done before, could be from a technology perspective, it could be from a regulatory perspective in terms of, oh, the Americans will never partner with us on ABCD, or we will never get ITAR approval for XYZ, or this kind of a technology has never been built in India, right? As long as it is within the rules of the land, and as long as it's within the laws of physics, everything is possible, right? Incumbents sometimes, because they become large and therefore sometimes can become bureaucratic, their default answer will become no. Startups is not, I mean, I think I would sort of urge everybody to reimagine what a startup means. A startup is not just a size issue. It's not just about a small or a young company. It's even some large companies can be extremely agile, can be extremely disruptive. Like you're seeing, not in a defense world, but you're seeing in the AI world with what Facebook is doing with open sourcing, for example, large language models, right? That's a very disruptive idea for a large corporation to do. So as long as you're disruptive in your thinking and your execution, you should be considered a startup. And I think that's the one advantage they have, which is if you are like that, you're able to think of things from first principle and ask yourself the questions, two questions. So what and why not? And if you ask yourself these two questions, whether you face technological or regulatory hurdles, or hurdles of bias of the past, that it's never been done before, or it's been tried, it didn't succeed, you're able to actually look at things from a fresh perspective and therefore more likely to be successful.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, Nikita, that's actually a very interesting question. But I think when I look back in terms of how has the compliance strategy changed over a period of time since we actually engaged more on the front of export control, I don't think it changed much, because space as a sector outright begins with a lot of boundaries that emerge from our public procurement system, and also from the regulations which are there, with, or rather guidelines which are there today from in space and other bodies, on how to safeguard technology and how it necessitates having proper due diligence within the company to engage into the business. But one thing that has been impacted substantially is how you build these programs and within the company, and strategize for scalability. To give some examples, when export control, no matter how streamlined, it always leaves an element of geopolitical uncertainty and a risk of longer turnaround times or change costs and things like that. So there, rather than compliance, it is regulatory and policy strategy that plays a larger role in ideating the right kind of supply chains and the kind of investment in doing R&D in-house, or ensuring vertical integration across the globe. So it's more on the regulatory strategy than the compliance. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it does. Thank you, Keyur. I'm now moving on to the questions from the chat. Let's see. All right. So I have this from Arun Babu. I'm not sure whether it's a reasonable question in this community. What are the recommended strategies and technological measures to mitigate the risks posed by space weather transient events, such as solar flares, coronal mass ejections during satellite launches and early operations in space? Arun from CUSAT. Keyur, do you think you'd be able to take a shot on this? And Ashish, feel free to jump in. Or anyone else
Okay.
who feels. Yeah.
I think I'll take a shot. I'm not the technical guy, I'm a lawyer, but I think largely the strategies that you do take for this is building radiation hardened materials. Where the hardware itself has to go through a certain set of standards. These standards are defined by the launch vehicle to say how tolerant it will be to certain shocks and vibrations, and then you do a study of the thermal and vacuum environment, and also the radiation environment that will be there in space. So a choice of materials to ensure tolerance of equipment, and to ensure tolerance of the loads and the environment that the satellite goes through at the time of launch and at the time of in-orbit injection, is what really helps you safeguard it. Without getting into technical details, since it's an export control seminar, I need to abide by export control.
Arun Babu, I hope it answers your question. I will move on to the next one. Arvind Pandey asks, how does the absence of regulatory and standardization framework regarding most of this space domain in India affect the export control? This is again space domain with respect to export control.
I think I'll take this one too.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
See, I think this has been a problem across the globe, and we see different countries treating it differently. How standardization has to largely be at the level of defining how technology is distinguished. For example, when we look at say something as simple as radiation tolerance to be defined, that may be different with respect of satellites and with respect of other electronics that are used for nuclear purposes. Today, how that impacts is there is no separate way in which, under the SCOMET framework, different technologies can be treated. Uh, we see an example of that in the recent amendment that is being made in how US is categorizing space technology items. But I think beyond that, there is not much of a difference today, since in SCOMET we don't see there being layers of technologies being treated differently. The timeline and the treatment for each one continues to be the same. So on export control specifically, there is not too much of complexity, since our export control agencies are also undergoing a, a, a curve of policy reforms to treat commercial space enterprises right.
All right, thank you, Keo. And it looks like we may have time for just one last question. And let's take this one from Kaushiki Singh. How do export control regulations impact FDI in India, particularly in sectors like technology and defense? Ashish, would you like to take a...
Yeah, yeah, happy to go have a on that. So I think obviously, given the restrictions on FDI in certain sectors, the FDI would always be either restricted or completely prohibited in key sensitive and sectors, like for example, defense or space or such kind of sectors. So it does, would impact FDI coming into India if you, especially if you would compare it, sectors where there are no restrictions or no prohibitions. So there is, from a theoretical point of view, potential that FDIs could be restricted in these sensitive sectors, and that's what we also see in many examples that we have in front of us.
Thank you so much, Ashish. That was very insightful. I'd like to thank all the speakers for your insightful presentations and thoughtful answers, and also SIA-India for partnering with Indus Tech Council on starting this amazing PRISM series. Thank you from my end.
Thank you, Nikita,
Thank you,
for
everyone.
your QA contribution. And I'm just having a small job to do. General Pandu could not make it because flight got delayed. So I have just presenting a small closing remark. I think this is the first series of our U.S. dialogue under PRISM, and we will be touching upon, as my opening remark said, that we will touching upon other countries also. And I see this kind of a dialogue will be a good platform to look at into various barriers. Oh, Janapal is here. Sir, just started. Please take the floor.
No, Anil, you can continue to talk because I have just got down from a very delayed flight, and if I may like to just say that it is really wonderful that this dialogue has started between India and US on the export control, and this dialogue is absolutely essential both for B2B and B2G progress. I was listening to the FDIs and the importance of the SDIs, yet there are a lot of regulations and a lot of considerations under which the FDI would be or not accepted or would not be encouraged. But I suppose together we can solve a lot of problems. It's a lot of give and take. The discussions that we have started, I think this is only the start point. This platform can actually become a facilitation center for the innovations and the startups who are looking for partnerships, because the barriers from both sides need to be not only understood, but we need to find the way that we can work around them and make sure that both countries understand the provisions of ITAR, EAR, SCOMET, and many other issues that people do not usually either understand, or if they understand, they do not know how to navigate through. And they do not know when you throw the rope, on the other side, there would be somebody to hold the rope. And it's only when you throw the rope and the other side supports and pulls the rope and ties it on together, that is the only way we can make bridges. And I think building bridges between the two democracies is extremely important. So I think both sides have to do this, that we tie each other's ropes to our own anchors and we build bridges for future innovations, future investment, and future economy. I think is all tied up together. And I think future is ours if we make endeavors to make it ours. And thank you very much. I think I missed the substantial part of it. but I have a general understanding that largely we headed in a very, very positive direction, and we look forward to having another one, but call it a facilitation for the business. And we can get questions from both the industry or institutions, and those questions we can find answers, and from both sides they can address this to the forum, and the forum will be able to be suitably put in expertise to help the cause. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, thank you, General Pandu. And at the end, I just want to say that we are coming out with a report on this dialogue jointly by SIA-India and the U.S. Tech Council, and we will be sharing update for further event which is coming up. With that, good night, good evening for everyone for joining. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.